Behind the Shades.
I'm Jocelyn. My website is jocelyneve.com. I work as a clinical social worker and group therapist in private practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I am hybrid, so also meeting with folks pretty much all over virtually. And I work primarily with adults, many of which who have some type of trauma history. I also run some groups, and that's something I'm excited to talk more about today, specifically a men's trauma group. And I also run a mixed gender trauma process group. So I talk a lot about groups, and I am excited to share more with you about that. But that's sort of the basics about who I am, and I'm very proud to share more about the work I do. I really love it and feel so lucky to do work that feels so meaningful and life-giving.
So take us through the genesis of your journey in regards to helping people in this way. Why did you get started and how did you get started?
Ooh, I love the question. I'm gonna peek at my notes too, because I don't want to get too, you have to rein me in if I get too all over the place. But I honestly think I was one of those weirdo children who wanted to be a therapist at age 8, which kind of says a lot because I had a mother who was a social worker. So I'm guessing that's how I attempted to spell psychotherapist in my journal. So I really, from a young age, saw myself as someone who wanted to help and someone who thought that I had some capacity to do good in the world. So I feel like that is also reflective of some of my kind of conditioning as a child of not just a social worker, but a family that really valued community service and to Tikkun Olam. It's kind of repair the world is a phrase in the Jewish tradition that I was raised with. So yeah, I'd say a combination of like all of us, nurture and nature. I definitely was a more sensitive child, still am, very, very sensitive, highly sensitive, and the youngest of three. And so I really have a lot of vivid memories of being kind of a peacemaker in the fourth grade classroom, just setting up shop with some of my peers as a kid, trying to be play therapist. So I think a lot about sort of how gender kind of informs some of the personality traits that we develop. And sometimes it makes me feel sad, other times it makes me feel proud, but in this moment I'm really grateful to feel like, those gifts of sensitivity that sometimes can feel like such a burden and so heavy, can also be, a gift and an asset, and something that I can do some good with even when it's hard. So that's
For
a little bit
me,
about sort of the
oh,
the
sorry, go ahead.
early Genesis. But yeah, I can say a bit more. Like I think, like a lot of fellow group therapists, I think about sort of my experiences in groups and communities in our like ecosystems. So like what was it like to be me as a kid, and how did, my experience inform and shape, um, yeah, wanting to become a group therapist, particularly like having experiences of bullying, for instance, for me, I think was really impactful as a child, and made me, hyper definitely sensitive to people who felt othered. And that kind of translated into getting involved in like anti-bullying work and the Gay Straight Alliance, just becoming involved in leadership roles and positions where I could kind of gravitate to like the new kid in the class, or just see. I seem to have like felt like I was a magnet for kids who were having hard times with their families. They ended up like kind of confiding in me. This is like middle school, high school, and um, I'd say like struggling with my own mental health in high school, having my first therapist, trying my first meds, like having my own journey in relationship to mental illness in my family has been really formative, and also made me very sensitive to, again, the kind of, so like, yeah, the dynamics that play out. So that I don't really see mental illness or trauma as something that is located in us as individuals, but rather sort of how are we, our little peaceful childlike beings, like then sort of impacted by the systems that we're in. So sometimes it's not feeling like I was in the best fit of a family, or not feeling like my needs might have been met in school or in work, and how those experiences of discrimination or ableism or kind of insert form of kind of like oppression that intersects with my different identities. It sort of felt like I was had a calling, that it was sort of a, in some ways, a choice, but in another way, like I had to learn how to advocate for myself and other people to survive in the environment that I was living. And that sort of sounds dramatic, but that is sort of how I think back to those many decades of journaling and activism, that it was something that I took pride in. And also I was like looking for my people. I was looking for allies and teachers and mentors and mother figures and father figures, people who believed in me and saw that I had something to offer in the world.
For me, when I first got started, I knew what I wanted to do, but I just needed guidance on how to fulfill it. And I gave the example of the difference between doing something for your passion and something for your paycheck. Your paycheck, you can ultimately learn. We can go to school, we can get experience, things like that. But I think each and every one of us are born with a passion that we have to cultivate internally, and then it grows until it reaches a point where it comes externally. And I'll give you an example. When I was in my teens, I knew that I always wanted to help people. I just didn't know in what way or how, right? Because you're young and you're foolish and you're like, yeah, I'm going to become the king of the world. And your parents are going to be like, yeah, okay, go to school and let's figure it out. So when I ultimately decided to do that, it started within religion. And then I started to give talks. I was like, okay, I can do this. I can enjoy the talks. I didn't have the fear of public speaking, which so many people do. And I took that and I amplified it to the person I am now, where instead of just within the congregation, it was a congregation, and then it became the meeting of congregations. And now I'm in the spotlight and I'm around all these people. And it was a little bit simpler in a way because all I needed was the good book. Whereas from our conversation, you're an educated person and I'm an educated person. We've read many books outside of that. So it's a little bit different, right? You don't ever stop learning. So
Mhm.
I take that and I say that because when I hear you speak about it, it sounds like something that was inside you that you had to grow and show the world that you can do this because you've gone through these different types of situations. And as you're going through these different types of situations, you start to see a piece of you in every single person that you're helping. Was that a perspective that you had back then? Or is that something a little bit different where as you're helping people, you're looking at it in a different type of way?
Ooh, such a great question. Wow. I Yeah, I feel like people are people. Like the longer I work with people, the less I feel like there is any divide between us, and that kind of risks kind of invisibilizing the very significant, lived experiences and unique circumstances. So I mean that in the sense that I don't think that during my childhood and youth and coming of age, I felt like I saw myself in others. I think I looked for my story in books, and I looked. I remember, reading about all these like really intense, kind of scary stories that I felt so alone. I think I felt so different, and I didn't have language. Children, obviously, this, don't have words for a lot of the pain and experiences that they're going through, which in some ways is harder today with social media and technology, and in some ways, there is more access to information and affinity spaces. But I do think that looking back now, I certainly can see more of those like points of connection. Like it's sort of wild to look back and sort of see that thread. But if you had told me when I was, even though I'm telling you I had these sort of kind of unusual like awarenesses about sort of some of my gifts and some of my inclinations towards being a helper. I definitely couldn't have dreamed that I would be able to, yeah, have a I don't know, get paid to do something so fulfilling, and that feels not like, it sounds cliche, but like it doesn't feel like work. Like it feels like, have you heard of the term like ikigai? It's like your life's purpose, or it's just sort of like, I don't know, it feels like a such a privilege to have work that it feels like you're doing what you love. And sure, I'm still human. I have days where work is exhausting and draining, and I can't wait for the weekend. But I know how unusual it is to feel the fulfillment and the sense of interconnectedness. Like I really want to highlight that, because I don't approach the work as like, yes, I have some education and training and I feel proud of that, and I work hard to like be like a lifelong learner. That's something I take very seriously, and I that fulfills me to always be learning. And like I feel like the relationship between myself and my clients is the healing agent, and that it's not about sort of being an expert and answering your problems and how can I fix you because you're so broken. It's like, no, like, we're gonna partner and I'm gonna join you, and helping to support, guide, shine a light on your path, and that I'm on one too, and that we're kind of in this together. So I feel like that's maybe something that a lot of people don't realize, maybe when they're approaching therapy. Obviously people look for different things in a therapist or a coach, but I'm certainly not someone who's looking to like market myself as someone who's like, yeah, gonna be the magic wand that takes you from this island to this one. Like I definitely believe in measuring like the outcomes and efficacy of what I'm doing. That I don't want to be in business. I want someone to sort of, write me a letter in 5 years and tell me how happy and how fulfilled and how glad they are to be where they are. But I'm not, yeah, just kind of trying to recognize that I believe in the relationship as the kind of the main vehicle for change.
That's a beautiful way to say it. And I guess the comparison I have, since I spent a little bit of time in this industry, would be like the fitness industry and the fitness trainers, right? Where you have some that they have their clients and it's like a lifetime client. No matter what they do, no matter what they're working on, they're with them for life, right? Just 10 more minutes on that treadmill and they're running and they're running and they're running and they're running,
Mhm.
right? And I think for therapists or coaches or people that are helping people grow in that way, we come across a lot of people who seem to be in the same spot in constant movement. They're not going anywhere, but they're always moving. And you're trying to steer them in a direction where they go from maybe a potential lifetime client to a lifetime success. And I think some people they misinterpret the difference because they may feel that I'm always going to need someone to guide me. And that is true. Like I need guidance and sounds like you have resolved that as well and you're into that as well. But it could be that you can go from Jocelyn to, let's say, you're guiding yourself, or Jocelyn just helping you maintain, or you're going from terrain and you're just maintaining. Because when I was working on myself, I can be reflective and say I needed someone at this point in my life because I wasn't sufficient for myself. Have you had those types of conversations within your own journey as you look back?
Hmm. Can you say a little bit more about the question? I want to make sure I understand in terms of those questions.
Absolutely. So for me, I'll give you an example. So in my 20s, I was struggling with the different types of relationships. I was
Mhm.
trying to navigate that section of my life, but there's a few things holding me back. One, I wasn't mature enough.
Mhm.
Looking back, at that
Right.
time, I felt I was the most mature person in the world, right?
Yep.
Um, Two, I wasn't ready for the type of relationships that I was trying to create. But at the time, I didn't know what I didn't know. So I can say that in hindsight because I have the experience and the education. But when you're going through it, as you pointed out earlier, you just don't know because you're trying to build the ship as you're flying it. So I guess my question for you now, to be more specific, is that as you look back, were there points in your life where you needed a little bit more knowing what you know now?
Honestly, I hope it's okay to take this in a little bit of a different direction. Feel free to steer me back, but what you're sharing is making me think about some of the reasons that I think men are like underrepresented in therapy. Cause like I was thinking coming on to the show right now that, you know, the statistics show how common it is for men to have experiences of trauma and abuse, and yet it's so underreported, and they're so much less likely men to come into therapy, to coaching. I'm sure it's the same. And like why there's so many reasons for that, but I think one is this sort of myth of like this might not be where you're coming from at all, but it's just kind of what's coming to me, this like sense that you're supposed to just not be phased, and you're supposed to, as a man, have it figured out, and not to have to need anyone, not to show weakness. So yeah, I'm curious kind of hearing your question. If I don't know if that's where you were going, but if that resonates at all for you.
It does, and that's where I was going because I mostly help women, and their perspective is a little bit different. Um, there's more available to them, right? Like, let's say if they're falling on hard times, or if there's like a mental health crisis, their resources is different and in more abundance. Whereas a man, and that's where when I look back, I'm like, okay, this is where I can use someone like a Jocelyn. This
Mm-hmm.
is where I could use someone, let's say like a terrain, where it was saying that these expectations that you're putting on yourself aren't necessarily fair because they haven't been earned. We all struggle. And I think for men specifically, they're trying to do one of two things. They're trying to say that I don't have to be this big, strong alpha male.
Mm-hmm.
And two, it's okay to tap into my emotions and say, hey, I don't know what I need to do to be successful. Is that where you come in? Where you're trying to guide them accordingly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the men I work with present in therapy for like a range of different reasons, and it does seem like, yeah, if I'm reflecting on the folks I've worked with, that they don't have quite the same history of having exposure and opportunity, access to therapy, or if they do, they've been like pretty negative experiences. I'm thinking of someone who shared recently that they think they were having some trouble in college, and they got referred to the counselor, and they were like this very cold, removed person being like, you should probably get on meds, and they were like, okay, thanks, bye. So I think that there's a lot of barriers to not just accessing kind of the helping relationship, but also finding the right fit. So yeah, I'm curious. I mean, it sounds like of course people have traumas perpetrated by people across all genders. So some people might not want to join, you know, a therapy group where I have a co-leader who's a male identified clinician, and there's me. So just sort of stating the obvious, but the research shows that it's all about the fit. And so I think that something I've been reflecting on is around the even within the field, the helping profession, like how much stigma there is about working with men. One of the big kind of moments of ahas for me a few years back was going to a conference about youth sex offenders. And I remember being, it was like my maybe mid to late 20s, like so astounded by how polarizing, like how siloed. I know that the field is full of silos. People are like in their corner, and they don't really know what's going on in another corner, even the same hospital or something. But people were talking about, I work with offenders, and I work with victims, or I work with perpetrators, and I work with survivors. And I was like, what is going on? This is bogus. Like, obviously, you know, sometimes those categories might exist on their own, but there's, I think, more often than not, a lot of overlap. And I think that, I don't know, I'm a little bit kind of going astray, but just thinking about the importance of recognizing the complexity. It's hard to kind of speak in generalities at all, but that there's, you know, a lot of important reasons that I think that it's so multifactorial, like the reasons that men are underrepresented, that they're not coming to therapy or coaching, even though they're suffering at disproportionate rates of suicide or depression or trauma. Like, so I like to think about like, what am I doing, as a social worker to help to bridge that gap? And like doing conversations like this is one example, like doing outreach, letting people know who are listening that there are clinicians who see them more with more complexity and nuance than like you're more than the worst thing you've done and we're more than the worst things that have happened to us, right?
So take us through that. What are some of the ways that maybe men can become more comfortable approaching the situation and seeking out help to make sure that they are working on themselves, even though the resources may not be as available, but it's still out there. So what are some of the ways that they can work on themselves to get to that point?
Well, as I mentioned, so I feel like in this day of like everything being available, all the information, there are so many fantastic free resources online that I think can be like a really maybe the equivalent to when we were growing up and you could go in the corner of a bookstore and like find some books that kind of speak to you. Obviously, people still do that, but like I definitely encourage, I'm a big proponent of sharing resources. So there's, menshealing.org, 1 in 6. There's so many great organizations, specifically menshealing.org, that focus on work with men. So NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, is another great one. So I feel like getting familiar on whether it's TikTok or Instagram or just the internet, like getting familiar with what's out there. It is for some people safer to explore things online. Now we have kind of free web chats, 24/7 hotlines. But you also, there's local services that people can go to support groups, neighborhood clinics. So I think that for everyone, it's going to look a little bit different. But my main thing that I'm always constantly repeating is shop around, like that you're in the driver's seat and to trust your instinct. I have a great article I like to share about like what to look for in a helper and a therapist, because I think that a lot of people come to look and they don't have any idea what what's all involved, and it can feel very disempowering. So to me, it's about being transparent and like giving clients all the information they need. These are the different types of talk therapies. These are non-talk, these are alternatives, kind of like what it means to have a free or have a consultation with someone means kind of giving them all the information that they need to make a choice, and to know what else is out there, to help them know. I think that so much of trauma informed care to me is helping people to recognize that they do have choices. And unfortunately, in our mental health care system, that often does not feel like, even when you think about healthcare, you try to find a PCP or a specialist, and it's not like they're like, oh, here's 5 names, here's their bios, and here's their number, call that. Like, it's doesn't feel like a person-centered experience. And I really do what I can to try to help people to know that, just because you've been referred to me, like, these are like, I encourage you to shop around and to trust and to maybe, give it a couple sessions to see if it feels like a good fit, but that they're in the driver's seat, and that it's important that they feel like, that they are respected and that they're in a, safe enough place that they can do some deep work. But that kind of educating them on the therapy process is something that I think can be a big service to men who are just kind of beginning to put their toes in the water. What do you think?
I think it's definitely needed. One of the challenges that I always found is the hesitation of men. And I found that to be a little bit difficult. And I can appreciate why, because as a man myself, um, sometimes I didn't have the words to ask for help. And sometimes I didn't understand. And I look at some of the obstacles that I faced, and I began to realize that many of it was systemic for men. And the reason why I say it that way is growing up, I was painted in a way to say that you don't cry, you're a man. You don't feel pain. You're a man. You don't show that you're hurt because you're a man. And for you, who works with these men who are trying to figure it out, and in a lot of way, they're hurting. They're damaged. I wonder if that is a commonality that maybe you see with the men who are trying to break free of society's expectations because they have to make a decision. Do I seek help and be strong in that way because asking for help is definitely courageous? Or do I keep it inside and suffer in silence like a lot of men do? But I appear strong. And that second part is could be the reason why depression is so high amongst men, why self-deletion is so high amongst men, why loneliness is so high amongst men. So what are some of the commonalities that you see when you're working with these men?
Yeah, so important. Everything you just said. Thank you for naming those points and realities. And I would, yeah, think about the narrow definition of masculinity and toxic masculinity that causes so much of the, I don't know, I think about the Me Too movement. I think about like white supremacy culture and all the like unlearning and reckoning that has been going on in recent years, especially what it means to be a man. And what I see in my office every week is a lot of loneliness and isolation, not just, within oneself internally, how one feels about themselves at the end of the day, but also even in alienation in their marriages and their relationships, a lot of infidelity or feeling of lack of intimacy, um, emotionally, sexually, all the spiritually, all the things, feeling really ostracized even within friend groups. Like there's a real sense of alienation and loneliness and feeling like it's just out of reach. And so it's very interesting and terrifying at the same time, like in terms of the all the violence that we're seeing, obviously in the world right now, but like in our country. I think you're in Canada, is that right? So I don't know all the things that are happening near you, but there's just been one of the biggest mass shootings here this past week, in the Northeast, and it's like every day. It's just constant. So it's an issue that I feel like my generation has really grown up around with these drills and active shooters. And how does that relate to the men I'm working with in my office? It feels like a lifeline, like doing this work, the courage that it takes to come in and to put down the armor and to let someone know what's really going on. It's really striking to me sometimes, like how incredibly difficult it is just to show up for therapy for some people. Like it's so brave and so taxing. And I know I've been there myself when it can feel like you've been hit by a truck after a therapy session or something, because it can be like so painful to like be with our emotions and our realities. And then just to see like on the kind of positive side what happens, like the growth and the intimacy that builds between us and the confidence, and then the ways that translates into their relationships and their careers and their dreams is, I know, I feel like you're nodding knowingly, like it's such an amazing process, and it doesn't even take that long. Like it's about creating safety, I think, in ourselves. And we do that in relationships. I always say trauma happens in relationships and healing does too. So it's such an amazing thing to see that what happens in therapy, translates right outside of the therapy relationship into, how often do people come and they get excited to tell you, oh, I set a boundary, or I had that conversation right after our session, and or I sent that text message, and just building that muscle. You talked about working out, retraining our brains, rewiring, those neural pathways that maybe have been conditioned to be anxiously attached or avoidant, that we can have earned secure relationships, and we can ask for what we want, and we can live fulfilling lives. So
What are some of the ways that you help the men that you work with to create boundaries and to maintain them going forward?
hmm. I mean, I think that our society does a terrible job at teaching us as children about boundaries. So I think it's getting better. There's a lot more kind of education and normalization of consent culture and bodily autonomy. So I think it starts with the kiddos. So if you're listening and you have any youth in your life, any kids you love, it's on all of us, I think, to do this kind of education with kids of all genders, of course. But in terms of mostly, I work with adults now, and I think it looks like modeling it, like in how I show up, how I hold my own boundaries and limits. Because it's a unique relationship. It's not like a friendship. It's not like a professor or a teacher relationship. So I think a lot of the work and learning is experiential and happens through us processing their own experience of what happens when this has come up a lot in regards to COVID, and we've all had to navigate different risk tolerances and kind of personal, intimate conversations that we never used to have. Like if you have a cold now, it's like suddenly everyone's business. Like you know, what, how sick are you? Or have you been exposed, even though it's been a couple of years? Some people are high risk and still sort of, dealing with the repercussions of COVID. So I'm just using that as a small example, but I think that it comes up regularly. There's probably no topic that I feel like is more consistent in my sessions and talking about relationships and boundaries. And yeah, I think a lot of that comes also from self-respect and self-esteem. Like people like who have experienced childhood trauma or have struggled with early kind of attachment issues often don't maybe have experience of feeling seen in relationships with kind of those core attachment figures. People who are supposed to love and protect them maybe weren't able to for some reason or another, and it leaves us as adults in our relationships sometimes hungering for connection but not really knowing how to do it. So we push people away, or we have certain patterns or tendencies that don't really serve us relationally speaking. So I think that that's one of the best, beautiful, most rewarding and difficult opportunities of therapy is learning what it means to be in relationship and to have to feel in integrity. So those are some of the hardest sessions too, I think, when there's some sort of like conflict in the therapy relationship, but also can be some of the most rewarding.
I remember giving a presentation not too long ago, this year, a while back, on the adverse childhood experiences and how so many of us have experienced a moment in our childhood where it can dictate or still have an impact on our adulthood. And then the numbers are staggering, right? Like we have people who have become very promiscuous because of it, very demanding, very abusive in different ways. And one thing that I highlighted was that there's many people who subconsciously are aware of the trauma, as you mentioned, that they've gone through, but they kind of put it in the back of their closet and they ignore it, right? And any dirty laundry that's there, it begins to smell and stink, and then it shows up in all these different ways, right? And I let some of the men and women, mostly women that I work with, know that, have you ever been in a situation, I've asked them, where something has happened and you've reacted in a way that even surprised you and you couldn't pinpoint it? And I told them it could be that it relates back to that. Maybe the way your father spoke to you, maybe the way your mother spoke to you, maybe the way that the children on the playground treated you and isolated you away from other people. And many people started to look back and be reflective. And then when I shared my story, how I grew up without my mother or my father, I felt wanting, right? Like being accepted on my accomplishments in my younger years, my teens, meant so much to me. So I went out of my way to be a high achiever. I want to have good grades in school. I want to do well in sports. I want to do all these things. And I had to understand the importance of boundaries in my adulthood, because me looking for acceptance outside, externally, I began to invite all the wrong people into my life. And that began to impact me in a negative way. And sometimes I look at men, they have the burden of performance.
Mm.
meaning that you have to be making six figures, 6 feet tall, right? You have to have all these things. You have to have the fastest car. You have to have the prettiest girl. You have to have all these things that demand on us. And when you touched on how they feel after therapy, for the men listening, showing up to that door of your therapist is courageous enough. That step through the door is another act of courage. Letting someone know what you're going through is another step of courage. So you should feel empowered and strengthened that you took the time to even explain what you're going through with someone that they really don't know us, but we built that trust. Now, Jocelyn, if I came to you and I said, Jocelyn, help me fix me, what are some of the ways that you would initially assist me outside the boundaries, but maybe like the conversation piece? How does that look like?
Outside the boundaries, what does it look like? I mean, I think about it as, hmm, I think about it in different ways depending on the person and what they're looking for, but really understanding together kind of what brought them here. Like what have their experiences, what have your experiences been, and to get like what's prompting you to seek support at this time and to get an understanding. And I always preface by saying, like, go at your own pace. I don't expect, like, sometimes you go to the doctor's office and they ask you like all the most personal questions, and now they do it in a form and then they don't read the form and then they ask you again and it's like, well, that was a waste. But so I'm very sensitive to not expecting people to, spill their guts to me upon meeting. So I guess I say this just to talk about moving at the speed of trust is very important, especially working with men or working with anyone who's maybe shares different identities. Like, I don't presume trust with anyone really, but especially to your point about the courage it takes just to show up, just to reach out. I often say that that's the hardest part. It's not an easy time to find help, let alone someone who's a good fit for you. So definitely honoring like what it takes to get there, and then to try to understand together like what brought you here, and what are your supports. I noticed you said something about feeling like you need fixing. Tell me about that. Like, when did you start like feeling that way, and help me to understand, who are the humans that make up your world. Do you have roommates, housemates, pets? Do you live with family, friends? Are you part of any religious, community groups? How do I understand who you are and like what matters to you? I'm very interested in people's hobbies and strengths and interests, and kind of making the work reflect, what's going well in your life. So I don't look at you as my client as something that needs fixing. So I would probably respectfully kind of, I would, utilize, reflect, mirror back the language that you use. So if that's what you think, I'm not gonna kind of challenge you on day one about that, but I am gonna try to understand and maybe provide like a different way of understanding you in like your context. That like I don't know if I would say this on day one, but you probably weren't born feeling that way. So how did you get here to this point where you feel like you need someone to fix you? Because yeah, that's a pretty strong statement, right?
How important is that trust aspect in what you do?
I think it's everything. I think something clicked when you were talking before, where I was like, yeah, people can be in therapy and not really be in therapy. Like, we can spend like, years talking about, I mean, I can say from my own experience, like growing up as a youth who did have access to some good therapists, like I wasn't ready to talk about those skeletons in the closet. Like, I didn't have access to those memories, and I also wasn't, yeah, I was kind of preoccupied with things that maybe teenage Jocelyn was worried about. And so I think that there is a kind of, again, moving at the speed of trust, but there's also like a readiness element. And I think that that can be really frustrating for loved ones at times, when maybe your partner or your, cousin or son or whatever are in therapy, but maybe you're like wondering what they're actually talking about. So it trust is everything, and safety is very complex. So it can take. I just had someone cry for like a man I worked with for like the first time after like a year of working together, and it felt like such a huge, huge moment. And such, it sounds like, a little melodramatic, but like it really like moved me. Like I could really feel him accessing the grief that like is so present in our work together, but like to actually feel like some of those walls are coming down where he can share with me like the pain that I know he can't share elsewhere. So like, other people, everyone has their own relationship to tears and crying, and it's just like yeah, really striking, I guess, for men in particular. I think how many walls and how many years and yeah, like how much it's been like ingrained in them, not just consciously, not don't cry, men don't cry, but like all the like intellectualizing and the, like you said, want to have be a provider and get the best this and all the performance pressure, that it really takes away the opportunity to connect with one's emotions and express oneself and have that deep intimate relationship that makes life worth living for many of us.
So, Justin, as we look to close, what's some guidance that you can give the men who are looking to figure it out? They want to take that step to the door and then ultimately the step through the door. How would you guide them?
I would say reach out. Like reach out to a therapist or a coach, or ask a friend to help you to take that step if you have someone you trust. But really just starting to do some little bit of research, maybe, challenge yourself to reach out to one person a week, do something that feels manageable. As I mentioned, I'm starting a men's group specifically for trauma and co-leading that with my colleague. So I think for some people, like group can be like a different way in, that for another person that might sound terrifying, but individual work, that people, different strokes for different folks. And I'd encourage people to consider what might be possible. Something that to me is very unique about a men's group is the opportunity to meet other men and connect with other men about things like what's really going on inside, to learn about the impact of trauma, and to get kind of familiar and intimate with people in a way that maybe feels less accessible in their work or in their social lives. So I really don't necessarily mean to preach that therapy is for everyone, like whether it's a coach, or some people find it at the gym, as you mentioned, or taking an art class, photography, like finding something, time in nature, that makes you feel less alone. That we need each other. We're very social creatures, and this has been an incredibly yeah, difficult time for many people for loads of reasons. And to just reach out and know that you're not alone. There are people like myself and like you who are really eager and passionate about doing this work.